There's a man the world thinks it knows. They know the jokes. They know the fists. They know the square jaw and the slow-burning stare that made a generation of kids pretend they could roundhouse kick their way out of anything. But here's the question nobody thought to ask. What was happening behind those eyes? What does a man carry inside himself when the whole world is laughing and cheering and watching, and he is standing alone in a room somewhere, staring at a mirror, wondering if any of it was real? What if the toughest man in Hollywood was, for most of his early life, the most frightened? What if the legend you grew up with was built not on confidence, but on a wound so old it had calcified into armor? And what if the thing that nearly destroyed him, the secret he kept for decades, was the very thing that made him who he is? Stay right here, because what you are about to hear is not the Chuck Norris you were sold. This is the one who actually existed. Carlos Ray Norris came into the world on March 10th, 1940, in a small town called Ryan, Oklahoma, a place so flat and dry and forgotten that the wind seemed to blow through it without bothering to stop. Ryan sat at the bottom of everything, geographically and economically, a cluster of dust and ambition that the Great Depression had ground down to almost nothing. The hospitals there were sparse, the prospects thinner, and the idea of one day being famous would have sounded like a fever dream told by someone who had spent too long in the summer heat. His mother was Wilma, a woman made of quiet steel and Christian faith, the kind of woman who could stretch a dollar until it begged for mercy and still find something to be grateful for at the dinner table. His father was Ray Norris, and Ray Norris was a disaster. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind of disaster that makes for clean narrative. He was the slow, grinding kind, an alcoholic, a man who drifted in and out of the family's life the way a storm cloud moves through a valley, darkening everything, leaving damage, then disappearing. He was absent more than he was present. When he was present, it would have been better if he wasn't. Carlos grew up watching his mother hold the family together with bare hands. She worked. She prayed. She moved the family around, from Ryan to Fresno, California, when Carlos was young, chasing work, chasing stability, chasing the whisper of something better. Fresno was not glamorous. It was agricultural and rough, and populated with people who were one bad season from losing everything. But it was warmer than Oklahoma, literally and figuratively, because at least the sun stayed long enough to make it feel like the world had not entirely given up. Young Carlos was shy. This is the part the action movies never showed you. He was not a natural fighter. He was not aggressive, not domineering, not the biggest or the toughest kid on the block. He was quiet and watchful and soft-spoken, the kind of boy who moved through hallways trying not to be noticed. He had no particular talent that announced itself early, no charisma that made rooms turn when he walked in. He was, in the most heartbreaking sense of the phrase, ordinary. And for a boy growing up without a father, in a family held together by a woman's faith and a mother's will, ordinary felt like a very long way from anything that mattered. The defining wound came from that absence. Not from a single dramatic moment, but from an accumulating silence. The silence at dinner when other boys talked about their fathers. The silence on Father's Day when the school made you draw a card for someone who would never read it. The silence inside Carlos himself, a growing hollow place where confidence and belonging were supposed to be. Ray Norris was not dead. He was just gone. And a dead father is something a boy can grieve and eventually understand. A father who chose to leave, who chose the bottle over his children, who drifted back occasionally and then drifted away again. That is a wound that does not close cleanly. It reopens every time you look in the mirror and wonder what it was about you that made you so easy to leave behind. Carlos was 16 years old when his parents finally divorced. By then, the damage was not fresh. It was structural, built into the way he saw himself. The way he moved through the world hunched slightly inward, eyes down, avoiding eye contact, never quite believing he had the right to take up space. He did not know it yet, but he was carrying a question inside him that would take decades to answer. The question was simple and devastating. Am I enough? He graduated high school without distinction and joined the United States Air Force in 1958. He was 18 years old, barely formed, carrying that hollow question into the military with him. The Air Force sent him to Aumler Air Base in South Korea, and it was there, in the gray mornings and the disciplined hours of a military posting on the other side of the world, that something happened that would change the entire trajectory of his life. He discovered Tang Soo Do. He discovered a worn, weathered training space where Korean martial artists moved with a precision and intentionality that he had never seen before. He found an instructor willing to teach him. And for the first time in his life, Carlos Ray Norris found something that asked everything of him and gave everything back in return. The training was brutal. It was repetitive and demanding and physically punishing in a way that civilian life had not prepared him for. But here is the extraordinary thing. He did not quit. He kept coming back. Every morning, every evening, every spare hour he could find. He wrapped his hands, and he bowed, and he worked. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something in that hollow place inside him began to fill. That worn training space in South Korea, the creak of the floorboards, the smell of sweat and canvas, the feeling of a GI tightening around him like a second skin. That became the place where Carlos Norris began the long process of becoming someone. He earned his black belt. He earned it the hard way, through years of dedicated practice, through failure and repetition, and the kind of commitment that only someone who has something to prove could sustain. That he came back from Korea and left the Air Force. He had a new wife now, Diane Holchek, whom he had married in 1958, a woman he loved deeply and who believed in him when belief was still a leap of faith. He had no money. He had no plan. He had a black belt and an idea. He opened a chain of martial arts schools across Southern California, Tang Soo Do schools that would eventually teach thousands of students. But in the beginning, there was nothing glamorous about it. He was knocking on doors. He was scraping together rent money. He was a young husband and eventually a young father, trying to turn a skill into a livelihood in a city that did not yet know what to do with him. Those years were lean in a way that would surprise people who watched him later on the big screen. There were mornings when he looked at his finances and felt the old hollow place open again, the same one from childhood, whispering that he was not enough, that this was not going to work, that he had bet his family's stability on something foolish and fragile. The schools barely broke even. He drove an old car. He stayed up late worrying in the way that young fathers worry, quietly, not wanting to let the fear show on his face in the morning. But here's the thing about a man who has been training his whole adult life to be disciplined, to get back up, to absorb impact without breaking. That man does not quit when the accounting looks bad. He leans in. He trains harder. He teaches better. And slowly, the school started to grow. IT was one of his famous students who opened the door that changed everything. Steve McQueen began training with Norris in the late 1960s. And McQueen looked at this quiet, intense, magnificently skilled young man and said something that nobody had said to Carlos before in quite that way. He said, "You should be in movies." Now, understand something about who Steve McQueen was in 1968. He was arguably the biggest movie star in the world. He was cool in the way that could not be manufactured, in a way that made other men measure themselves against him and come up short. When Steve McQueen looked at you and said you had something, that was not a casual compliment. That was a door swinging open on its hinges, but the road from there to the screen was not a straight line. Chuck, as he now called himself, a nickname from his Air Force days, spent years trying to break into an industry that did not quite have a category for him yet. He was not a leading man in the traditional sense. He was not a comedian, not a dramatic actor trained at a conservatory. He was a martial artist who moved like nobody else on camera, with an economy and precision that was almost hypnotic once you knew to look for it. He lost roles. He almost quit. He took small parts and supporting appearances and kept working his schools and kept training day after day in that same disciplined way he had learned in Korea, the GI still familiar across his shoulders like an old conversation. Then came the blow that nearly ended everything. Not a career setback, something worse. In 1970, his younger brother Whelan Norris was killed in Vietnam. He was 24 years old. He had been deployed only 5 weeks. Chuck received the news the way you receive the worst news, alone with it for a moment before the world rushed back in, the specific silence of understanding that someone is gone and that the specific version of the world that included them has collapsed. Whelan was not just a brother. He was part of the foundation. He was the connection back to those Oklahoma years, to Wilma's kitchen, to everything that had come before the Air Force and Korea and the schools and the slow climb towards something. The grief was enormous and largely private. Chuck Norris was not a man who performed pain. His faith, a deep and steady Christian faith that he had come to on his own terms, not from obligation but from genuine conviction, was where he went with the unbearable. He believed in something beyond the physical world, something that could hold the weight of a brother's death without breaking. But even faith cannot make grief small. It can only make it survivable. He carried Whelan with him. He carries him still. If you know where to look, you can see it sometimes in the way he speaks about sacrifice, about the cost of freedom, about the men and women who do not come home, that he could have collapsed into the loss. He could have gone the way of his father, into the bottle, into absence. Instead, he trained. He went back to the mat. He came back to the GI, to the discipline, to the daily practice that had saved him once already and would save him again. It was around this time that the career began, seriously and irreversibly, to open. His friendship with Bruce Lee led to a legendary screen fight in a 1972 film Way of the Dragon, filmed in the Colosseum in Rome. If you have not watched it, it is extraordinary. Two of the most gifted martial artists of the 20th century, treating each other with something that looks almost like reverence, even as they are trying to defeat each other. Chuck lost the fight on screen, which tells you something about the kind of man he was. He was not interested in protecting his ego. He was interested in doing good work. Bruce Lee had been a friend and a training partner, and when Lee died in 1973, Chuck lost another piece of the world that had shaped him. But by then, the machine was running. Films, dozens of them. Breaker, in 1977, then Good Guys Wear Black, then A Force of One. Each one built the legend a little higher. By 1983, Missing in Action landed in theaters and detonated. The film was raw and patriotic and spoke directly to an America still processing the open wound of Vietnam, still sitting with the uncomfortable truth that the country had not brought all its sons home. Chuck Norris, whose own brother had died in that war, walked through those films with a grief that was genuine and a fury that was earned. The audiences felt it. They responded. And then Walker, Texas Ranger, arrived in 1993 and changed everything again. For 8 seasons, Chuck Norris was one of the most recognizable faces on American television. Walker was honorable, plain-spoken, deeply moral, and completely without irony. In an era that was beginning to celebrate cynicism as sophistication, here was a character who believed in right and wrong without apologizing for it. Audiences responded to that simplicity not because they were naive, but because simplicity is not the same thing as stupidity. Sometimes the plainest truths are the ones that endure. But here is where the story becomes more complicated than the legend allows. His marriage to Diane ended in 1988 after 30 years. 30 years. That is not a casual relationship, not a Hollywood dalliance. That is the whole of his adult life. The woman who stood with him through the lean years and the lean schools and the grief of his brother and the long climb to everything. The ending of it was not discussed publicly in the way celebrity divorces get examined and dissected. He carried that too. He had 2 sons with Diane, Mike and Eric, and the dissolution of the family he had built was a pain that the GI could not absorb, that no training could metabolize completely. There was also a revelation that came later in a way that required extraordinary courage. In 1991, Chuck publicly acknowledged that he had a daughter from a brief relationship earlier in his life, a daughter named Dina, who had been raised without knowing him as her father. He could have kept that secret. Many men in his position would have. But he chose honesty over comfort, chose the harder thing because it was the right thing, the same code that Walker, Texas Ranger preached every Saturday night, and that Chuck Norris had actually lived by more imperfectly and more humanly than the television version suggested. He and Dina eventually built a relationship. It was not without difficulty, but it was real. He married Gina O'Kelly in 1998 and found something he had not quite had before, a partnership in the fullest sense, a woman who matched him in devotion and who became the center of everything that came after. They have twins together, born in 2001. He was 60 years old when his twins were born. Think about that. Think about what it means to be 60 years old and beginning again, holding newborns in hands that had spent 40 years in dojos and on film sets and in the private grief of loss. It was, by all accounts, a transformation, a reopening. In 2012, Gina's health became the consuming challenge of his life. A medical procedure left her with what she and her doctors described as a catastrophic reaction, and for years Chuck became her full-time caregiver. He spoke publicly about it later, about the bills, about the fear, about the nights of sitting beside her bed watching her breathe, about the specific terror of watching the person who holds your world together begin to struggle. He sued the manufacturers of a contrast dye agent used during her MRI for more than $1 billion, not primarily for the money, but to force accountability, to make sure what happened to Gina did not happen to someone else without warning. This is the man that the jokes never reached. The man in the waiting room. The man keeping vigil. The man who had survived a father's absence and a brother's death and a marriage's end and decades of physical battering and the slow erosion of fame, and who found himself, in his 70s, doing the most fundamental human thing, loving someone and being terrified of losing them. His faith was not a prop in any of this. It was load-bearing. He spoke about it plainly, without the theatrical fervor that makes faith seem like performance. He said simply that he believed that the belief had been tested and survived the tests, and that it was the thing under everything else, under the GI, under the black belt, under the films and the television show and the internet mythology. It was the answer to the question he had carried since childhood, the one about whether he was enough. The answer, as he eventually understood it, was that the question had been addressed to the wrong place. Not enough for whom? Not enough by whose measure? His legacy now is layered in ways that are genuinely interesting to sit with. There is the cultural mythology, the jokes, the memes, the impossible physical feats attributed to him online that he himself has always found amusing rather than troubling. He understands that the Chuck Norris of the internet is a character, a symbol, a projection of a certain ideal of indomitable toughness that culture needed to have somewhere. He has never been precious about it. He has played along. He has laughed at himself with a warmth that the action movie version never quite conveyed. But underneath the mythology is the real record. Millions of students trained in martial arts schools that trace their lineage back to what he built. Veterans organizations that he has supported quietly for decades. Children's charities. A commitment to military families that has never been cynical and has never been for cameras. He has used his name the way a person uses a tool, not to accumulate more of itself, but to accomplish things that matter. And then there's what he represents to the people who actually watched him, who grew up with Walker on Saturday evenings and felt something settle in them when he stood for what was right without apologizing. What he gave them was not just entertainment. It was a model, quiet strength, unshowy integrity, the idea that you could be tough without being cruel, that you could believe without being preachy, that you could get knocked down professionally, personally, in every way that matters, and get back up not because you are invincible, but because you have decided again and again that getting back up is who you are. The boy from Ryan, Oklahoma, who carried a hollow place where his father's presence should have been, who found a worn training space in South Korea and wrapped himself in a GI and began the long work of becoming someone. That boy is still in there. You can see him sometimes in interviews in the slight hesitation before he answers a question about pain, in the careful way he speaks about his brother, in the way his eyes go quiet and private when he talks about what he believes. Now I want to talk to you. Not about Chuck Norris. About you. Because you have been sitting with this story for a reason, and I do not think it is only because you wanted to know about a movie star. I think you watched because you recognized something. Maybe it is the father who was not there, or the hollow question that still sometimes wakes you up at 3 in the morning. The one about whether you are enough, whether any of what you have built is real, whether the person you have become is someone who would make the frightened younger version of you feel less alone. You will notice that Chuck Norris never became tough by pretending the pain did not exist. He became tough by going into the training room anyway, by wrapping himself in the GI, that same worn, familiar weight, and showing up even on the mornings when showing up felt pointless. He became what he became not by being invulnerable, but by being day after day undeniable in his commitment to the work, to the discipline, to the people who needed him, to the belief that something larger than him was holding the parts of the story he could not hold himself. The GI is still in him, not as a piece of clothing, but as a practice, a daily returning to what matters, a refusal to let loss become an excuse for absence. You have a GI too, even if it looks nothing like his. It might be the morning you get up and go anyway. The conversation you keep showing up for even when it costs you. The belief you hold onto even when the evidence for it feels thin. The question is not whether you are tough enough. The question is whether you are willing to put the thing on and go back to the mat. What will you wrap yourself in tomorrow?